Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the One Thing podcast. We're hitting you with a Chris and Nikki special today. Co-hosts dropping some One Thing knowledge. We're super excited. We always have our listeners and our viewers reaching out to us, Chris, with questions or topics that they want to talk about. And we thought we could consolidate something that's been coming up, especially lately, but always comes up really in coaching. And also has been coming up for those that reach out to podcasts at The One Thing with questions on how to apply the One Thing concepts in their life and in their business, which is this idea of the monotony of success. And one of the biggest challenges that we see when we're coaching people or when we're consulting businesses, Chris, is that the thing no one talks about, one of the biggest challenges we see is that very few people prepare you for the monotony of success. And what we mean by that is that success is pretty boring. And it looks a lot like doing the same thing over and over and over and over again, waiting for the results to show up. And during the period that you're in the monotony of success, it can feel boring, or it can feel not as sexy as everybody promised entrepreneurship or growth might be, or it can feel like you're not making any progress. And these are often the impetus for people's challenges, or for people getting down on themselves, or for people not achieving the goal at all because they choose to give up. And so we're going to walk you through some of the tactics that we use in order to move people through that period, how to know when it's showing up, but also above all, how to bear the monotony of success, because that is the thing that most people have to make peace with in order to get to where they want to go.
Yeah, I think there's an underlying fallacy that comes up either subconsciously or consciously for people, that it needs to be difficult or challenging or exciting, or that there's this constant churn of new, and really that's not always true. That sometimes the path to success, or more often than not, the path to success is doing the small stuff consistently over time that will catch the hockey stick for you in the long run.
Well, and it's how to make the most of ordinary days. We did a training a few months back, Jay and I did, on just sort of designing your perfect week, which I bet we're going to get into a bit today. But the whole premise of the conversation was designing your perfect week, because really what you're looking for is stringing together a bunch of, we call them perfect weeks in the training, but it's really sort of average weeks where we're achieving the average thing we need to do in order to get to this greater goal. Because the truth is, we very rarely get the big celebrations, or we very rarely get the big moments. We very rarely have those in the scheme of time. And so really what we have to do is actually plan for the average, plan for the monotonous weeks, wherein we're inching our way towards that big result. Because if we're always looking for the really exciting thing, or the best week ever, or this great thing to happen, I mean, Chris, we're going to be sorely disappointed. Most weeks are fairly average.
It's true. I mean, you're in like a testing period for a while where you're being challenged to build momentum, and that snowball starts really small. And then for the longest period of time in this process, it makes very little or no change, or it's hard to recognize the growth that you're making because it is small and you're building momentum. But then all of a sudden you will see success, and it's surviving that period of monotony, or what feels like repetition. And in doing this, you're forcing yourself to do things like build habits and to gain knowledge. And that stuff is small, these 1% gains over time, that when they do start to add up and rack up, you gain that momentum, and then you catch the curve in the hockey stick and you see all the success.
And I think what's so important about this, Chris, is I think the question that comes up for both of us a lot in coaching or in consulting big organizations, it's, well, how do we know the difference between I'm sort of in the middle of my monotonous success, I'm on my monotonous journey to where I want to go, or I'm doing the wrong thing because nothing's happening. And I think that's what comes up so often in coaching, is that people don't feel like they're moving fast enough. So they just think, well, I'm just going to quit if I'm not getting to where I want to go. When really they're actually just experiencing, again, the monotony of success. And then on the other side, there's sometimes where someone sticks with something a little bit too long that quite simply isn't working. And there is a balance of figuring out where you are.
Yeah, that's where I think really powerful reflection, like consistent cadence of reflection, will serve you, and looking for the evidence of whether or not your plan is working. And you don't want to be shifting your goals in the bigger picture too much, but if you're really good at reflection, you can make the small little changes incrementally that will actually keep you correcting course over time. But I think to answer your point, like if you're curious, if what you're doing is boredom, or what's coming out for you is boredom, or you're just not seeing the results, is look for evidence, look back, look in the rearview mirror.
And don't worry, we won't leave you hanging. We're actually going to give you a model to do that today. And so let's talk about, Chris, where you usually see this come up, because you are coaching and consulting organizations day in, day out, every single day. Where does this usually show up for people?
Yeah, maybe it's healthy to draw a line in the professional and personal, and a little bit of a distinction, though there's a ton of common ground. It's how it shows up might be a little bit different. And professionally, you're going to have some built-in, in most cases, some built-in accountability and structure that will force you to be a little bit more consistent because you have to show up and you have to report in and you have KPIs and these kinds of things. So that's one area. Personally, I think it's a little bit of a different challenge because you have less of that structure inherently and less accountability. And so it's easy to pick up a goal that you want to focus on. It could be health or finances or something like that, and get kind of bored with or feel like you're in this process of monotony with these goals and then give up on them. And so those, I think there's a little bit of a different application, but it's important to draw the distinction.
I'd also love to know if you see this, Chris. I think often I see with people in their personal goals in business, to your point, it's easy to track some of the smaller measures because you build really powerful KPIs and you're accountable to them. And if you don't own your business, you're reporting to somebody within the business. And even if you do own your business, maybe you have a coach or you have people that you're investors or shareholders that you're reporting those numbers to. So when you make small changes, it's easy, or even make incremental progress forward. It's still easy to see it. So you may not be getting to the end result that you want to get to, but at least you are tracking yourself along the way. And I find that in our personal lives, we just tend not to do that. We just tend not to track as well. Right. And so then I'll use weight loss as an example, because that's something that comes up a lot for people in their health goals, is that they're not tracking their input. So they're not tracking their food and they're not tracking their exercise. And then they get sort of down on themselves or feel like, well, why am I not hitting the goal of losing the weight? Or on the other side, maybe they're not tracking the weight loss on the way, because losing 50 pounds is a huge endeavor. And if you're not tracking and giving yourself some celebration along the way, you might get 3 months in, and sure, you're not going to be anywhere close to the 50 pounds, but 5 pounds or 10 pounds or 15 pounds along the way. And that's still a huge celebration. But if you're not tracking that and actually giving yourself credit along the way, you're probably going to get pretty discouraged.
Yeah. It's so true. And on the professional front, you still have this showing up for individuals and this kind of monotony. And as a leader, you need to kind of interrogate and dig in to catch it, because your feedback will be a lagging measure. Right? You won't catch it until the results have stopped showing up, the ones that you want, and then you find out that somebody's shifted course or is kind of burnt out on a process or whatever it might be. But also professionally, it's interesting to think about organizational behaviors, and if you're getting monotonous in the processes that you're using and people are starting to fall out of consistency because they're just kind of burnt out on doing the same things over and over again. So I think there's another interesting dynamic when you think about your organization.
Without a doubt. I think, Chris, you have to build in, as an organization, you have to build in some time or some safe space for people to innovate and to try new things. Because I find, especially I focus so much in organizations on systems and systematic behavior, that when an organization actually has built great systems and people aren't following them, it's usually because they just need a little bit of variety, right? They need a little spice in their life. They've been doing the same thing the same way over and over and over again, which can get really boring. And most people can't make peace with the boring. So you have to give them a safe space to be able to do a little bit of innovation or creativity and still make sure that they're holding the line on these systems that are really integral.
Yeah, I'd say two things there. One is, authorship is ownership. So like include your team in the design of the system and process as much as is appropriate. I mean, there's a balance to strike there, of course, but the more DNA that they can have in what they're doing, the more bought in they're going to be in doing it, theoretically. And I'd say that's, again, a balance to strike for sure when it comes to how much you want to engage the team. Another thing to consider in an organization is how wide are you setting the bumpers on the bowling lane, right? Like how much, like, 'cause consistent structure is important, but if you make that consistency so narrow that you limit people's autonomy, then I think you're going to see them burn out much faster.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that this is where we focus so heavily on, we call it the domino effect and the one thing, right? That we're making decisions as a leader about where do we want to go. And then we're using the really smart and talented people that we hire to help us navigate what the path is going to be along the way there. And then we're building KPIs and accountability on what our mile markers and what our dominoes are leading up to that big goal. As a group, we're making decisions about what this looks like and how we're all going to contribute to it.
Yeah, you nailed it. I think a really key underlying principle here is what we call the domino effect. And in short, it's describing this exponential success. That exponential success is sequential. It's not simultaneous, right? So what we're saying is line up your dominoes. And if you line them up correctly, like these dominoes, they can get incrementally bigger, exponentially bigger over time. So if you line them up just the right way and you work your way backwards from this big domino out in the future, you come all the way back to the small, tiny little domino that you knock over today that feels almost effortless, right? If you do it right and you line them up correctly, you go so small in the day to day that it doesn't feel like you have to accomplish this big thing every day. You're just doing the small things, but because you're really intentional about how those things line up, they knock over bigger and bigger dominoes. And that's an important call out to set up this conversation because if you're going small enough, it does feel kind of effortless and it can feel kind of like, should I be doing more? Should I be, I feel like this should be more exciting or interesting sometimes, and it shouldn't. And that's the trap you can get caught in.
Without a doubt. And I also think on the other side, one of the things that we see is achievers, your inclination is going to be to achieve. So I love what you just said, Chris, because part of the goal of building out these small steps along the way is giving yourself permission to stop. Because if you don't, every day you're going to end the day thinking, did I do enough? Could I have done more? And the answer to that question, by the way, is always yes. Like you could always do more. You also could end up working yourself into oblivion, right? Which we don't want either. The goal of this is to have some type of balance and to enjoy your life and the process along the way to this big goal. And I think one of the most important things that people miss in bearing the monotony of success is that they have to have a stopping point every single day, because then as an achiever, your inclination will be to not stop. And every day you will end the day thinking those exact questions. Did I do enough? Could I have done more? Maybe I should work a little bit more. And it's just a really fast path to complete burnout.
Yeah, for sure. There's kind of two. I'd say one's more common than the other, but there's kind of two extremes in tendencies, or I guess like kind of natural inclination. And you have some people are really good at big vision, thinking big, pushing themselves to think big. You know, and Gino Wickman's EOS. You know, this is the visionary, right? And this person can really push themselves to think big. On the other end of that spectrum, some people really struggle to think big. Maybe they have limiting beliefs, personal experience that really challenges them to think big enough. And I'd say it's important to recognize, like, have some, self-awareness about your tendencies and where you are, because it could impact like what you need to focus on first. But a common, just general challenge that we see people faced with is that they tend to think big and try to go big. Right? Think big, have a big vision of the future, and then take big action. Right? And that's I think it's a trap to fall into, and it's something to be cautious of, because what we want you to do is to think big but go really small. And you're
Yes.
constantly kind of looking at both ends of the spectrum. What's the big vision? How do we work our way? And what's the small action we need to take today?
And the beautiful part about this is exactly that when you flip the coin, you can see how important it is to just make these incremental gains every single day. Because on the other side, if you don't have a plan, if you haven't decided where you're going, if you haven't decided what enough looks like every single day, you also could potentially find yourself on the inverse of that plan, right? The flip side of that coin, which is that I'm actually not putting my best foot forward every single day. And every day I'm making incremental gains, but in a downward trajectory. And then I look up and I'm not where I want to be. And it's simply because I wasn't putting forth the right effort or pointing the right direction every single day.
Yeah, and if you're the person who struggles with big vision, the challenge you might run into is that you are doing a lot of work, but its direction is scattered. And there's a quote that you say, and I can't remember it, but a ship with no sails doesn't care which way the wind's blowing, something like this.
Yeah, a ship with no direction doesn't care which way the wind blows, or a ship with no destination.
There you go. And I think you could run that risk, right? You're doing a lot of great work, but because you're not being really intentional about how you line up your dominoes, that you're missing that exponential impact of the sequentially larger dominoes towards a bigger vision.
So if I was someone who was doing some self-assessment here and I couldn't find out whether it was because I was just feeling bored and feeling like I need a little spice in my life, or if I actually wasn't on the right track and I didn't have the right plan, how would I know? Like if I was this person who in the description that you just gave, and I'm not actually getting to where I want to go, I don't actually have the right steps organized every day, or I do and I'm just feeling bored. How do we figure out who they are?
Let's make an assumption that you have done some work to on the professional front, you feel like you have good goals, your organization has like a good vision of the future, or personally, you've set some good goals, and maybe you could think bigger, but ultimately you feel like you've at least got something, your compass is pointed north. I'd say to determine whether or not you are on the right path and the small steps you're taking are working is just look for the evidence, right? Look backwards and say, am I seeing growth in the direction that I want to move? And it's this whole concept of the gap and the gain, I think, is so helpful in this context, which, to put it briefly, is the gap is the distance between where you are and ideal, like what your big goal is in the future. And just saying the distance between where I am today and this big success in the future is vast, and you orient yourself only on that gap, it's going to look like you're not making enough progress every day. And that's a challenge versus the gain, which is looking backwards and not, it doesn't have to be huge increments of time, but just maybe over the last month, have you seen success that the plan that you've implemented is working? And maybe it's not showing in the big numbers, but look in the small behaviors. And so really interrogate and look for the evidence.
Well, and I think this is where I always tell people that if you can't celebrate the small wins, you'll never be able to celebrate the big wins.
Mm.
And you have to do a little bit of celebration and reflection. So celebration usually comes from that along the way, and give yourself an opportunity to acknowledge the work that's going in. Because part of the premise of the gap and the gain is that it gives you the opportunity to not only recognize what you've done, but obviously recognize a bigger gap and potentially close that gap a bit using the one thing principles to say, I'm going to focus on this is my ultimate goal or this is my someday goal. And yet there are mile markers along the way that will tell me that I'm on the right path. And we need to create some mile markers that are in a much shorter time frame so that we can be encouraged, because just working towards your 5-year goal is really challenging for most people to keep their head in the game when what we're working towards is just so far in the future.
Yeah. An interesting, I think, consideration, if you're a leader, if you're a business owner, you're running a business, like we have this tendency to want to see the results. And sometimes it's difficult to celebrate, even if you're off track, the gains that the team or you might be making in the organization in the short term, just to keep that positive energy and to help people with staying in the monotony of success. Like you have to be really intentional with your messaging and balance, like push the team to continue to grow, because you are trying to catch a hockey stick in most cases. Like you as the leader want to see that curve, you want to catch the elbow, but you're in that grind. And so you have to keep your team from falling into this trap of like not feeling like they're making gains. So how do you look back and find those small things and celebrate them so that you can keep people in the process?
Yes, in organizations, we often talk about rewarding behavior towards the bigger goal, because just like you said, it's really challenging when you're early on in initiatives to see the actual results come up, especially if it's a larger initiative for your business, which can be a little bit deflating for the people who are working towards it too. So you have to actually reward the behavior of, you did a great job of doing this task or executing this system or closing the sale, even though it's one of 100 that we need to make. And if you're not celebrating them along the way, well, they're going to get deflated too. And ultimately, you need that team in order to get to this bigger goal of the organization.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting, right? Because on one hand, let's say you do own a business and you're like, we got to make money. We got to pay the bills. I got to make payroll. So you know that target's there. And at the end of the day, if you're not hitting this mark, nothing else matters. But not everyone on your team is prepared necessarily to handle the message the way that it deep down you want to send it. So you have to find a way to celebrate and keep people in this, because they might be battling with this monotony of success and they're like, I'm just grinding here and not seeing it. So from the top, you have to keep people in the zone and just be careful. It is a balance, right? You don't want to hold people's hands and coddle them, and to believing something that's not true. But also you don't want to just torpedo their ship and make them feel like they're not making incremental gains.
I think it's something that people miss in organizations a lot, Chris, wherein we talk a lot about culture in organizations, and yet I'll continue to be an advocate for the best cultures that I see are just the ones that win, right? And ultimately there's a lot of great things and important things that come into creating great cultures, but the cultures that I see really thrive are the organizations that are winning at a really high level. And so if people feel like they're losing all the time and they don't feel like they're actually making incremental gains, and the conversation is it's not enough or it's not where we want to be, and that's just consistently the rhetoric, it's just really hard to keep people motivated in that environment.
Yeah, no doubt. No doubt. And on the personal side too, I'd say that you probably have more inherent structure to surface some of this in a healthy culture in a business. Personally, it's crazy. We use this tool we call the 411, and you guys hopefully have heard about it. It's a goal work back. You've got personal and professional goals broken down by year, month, and week. And I'll have people fill this out for the first time. And if they're, career professional, and even if not, their professional goals just full. In fact, there's too many things on there, and we have to actually like apply the 20% and reduce it down and get them focused on the most important work. And on the personal side, it's like squeezing a stone to get them to put goals on there, and so you tend to have this big disparity. But that's where I think you see this monotony of success showing up the most in the personal application, and people just get so focused on the gap between where they are and ideal that they don't recognize all the small gains that they're making. And a really great way to do this in a business or for personal goals, we use a tool we call the 7 circles, and it puts your 7 kind of key areas of life in view, and you can go through and kind of rate yourself periodically on how you're doing in each area. And if you do that every 6 months or even shorter intervals of time, you can see these little incremental gains, and it's good reflection. It's a good tool. You can also do this for your business and identify the kind of 3, 5, 7 key areas of your business and do the same kind of reflection.
Well, I think also going back to the business example that we're using of encouraging your team along the way, in your personal example, it's so important to keep your self-talk and your headspace right, because we'll coach people often where they're just so hard on themselves, Chris. They're so hard on themselves, and it's not good enough, or it's not enough, or I could have done more. And that's just a hard place to live. I mean, imagine if you said that to your team every single day. And often I'll be coaching someone and I'll say, I want you to say that, but to me. And they're like, oh, no, I could never. I'm like, then why would you ever consider saying it to yourself? Because someone saying that to you all the time is a really quick way to look up one day and just say, well, if it's never good enough, I just quit.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. I mean, we live in the social media age where it's easy to not only look against the gap from you and your ideal, but you get to see this like curated version of ideal all the time. And so you see this huge gap, and it's just not reality. And you'd benefit a lot more from just looking at, again, the gains that you're making incrementally over time and celebrate them as small as they might be. Because like we said, you're just starting with the small dominoes and gaining momentum over time.
So let's talk through, Chris, what are some of the habitual things that you get your coaching clients, that we get our corporate partners to do in order to bear this monotony of success, in order to make sure that they keep their head in the game on the way to that bigger goal?
Yeah, habits are crucial here. I think just generally when you're talking about behavior change, like you're doing it in the service forming habits, and you don't want to think of, and it's the third lie, a disciplined life, and the One Thing book, that this illusion that you have that success is this marathon of discipline, that you need to just have incredible amounts of discipline and have this discipline over time. Instead, it's really about using discipline in sprints to form habits. And if you are consistently forming new habits, then you are making this behavior change over time. So habits are really important. And when you're thinking about like this monotony of success, if you're feeling like you're stuck and you're bored, then what you should be trying to do is just keep trying to form new habits that stack on top of each other over time. And when you look back, you're a completely different person.
Absolutely. And I think ultimately it's also about building this habitual pattern wherein you can look back and use that habit as evidence for how you can see this goal come to fruition in the future. Right? Part of building great habits is also using them to look back at some of the evidence that you need when you are in this monotonous space of success. Oh, I've been here before. Remember when I achieved X and I was showing up to the office every day doing this thing, and I thought, I'm never going to be able to get there, or I'm never going to be able to achieve this. And eventually I looked up and I was there. And that's where habits also become your evidence.
Yeah, well said. When you're forming habits, you're looking for consistency versus intensity. And I think that's just such an important reminder, because you tend to want to make big behavior swings in short periods of time. And that's another trap to watch out for. What you're trying to do is go small enough, right? Go all the way down to the smallest little thing, that if you did that consistently for a period of time, you would form this habit. And while you're forming this habit, you run through the arc of your discipline wearing out, starts to feel monotonous. And if you do it just right, just before it feels so repetitive that it's hard to do, the habit's formed and you have this behavior in place, and you can start to focus on something else that will feel interesting and potentially exciting, but it's still small. It's not intense. It's not intense exciting. It's just a new thing to focus on that stacks on the last behavior.
One of my favorite quotes by Seneca is, if you want a beautiful life, make beautiful choices. And that's
Mm,
really all habits are, right? Habits are choices that I've previously made and that usually I've bridged the gap between what I was doing before and what I'm doing now. And now it's just become a habitual pattern. It's not a choice anymore. It's something that I chose for a period of time, which is all you're saying. That's discipline is simply a bridge between action and habit. Or in this case, I would call it choice and habit. I've made a decision to show up a certain way that's probably different than how I used to in the past. And now I've made that decision enough times in a row that it's become part of who I am. And that's when it turns into a habit.
yeah. Something we talk a lot about and you hear a lot about, and people perceive mostly habits in the context of themselves. It's interesting to think about organizational habits too. And if you're looking at your business or your team, what are the habits that they're forming, and also the behaviors, because that stuff can start to feel overly what's the word I'm looking for? Just monotonous too, I guess. And there's a great example. We worked with an organization that they recognized they'd formed a bad habit, and everybody was getting burnt out. Their calendars were stacked end to end. They felt like they didn't have time to focus on the most important things. They were drowning in meetings. And so they recognized this, and they applied the 80-20 rule to their meetings and said, okay, who's the 20% on this potential list of attendees that really needs to attend? And they formed a new habit of doing this, and over time they freed up hours per week for their team. And anybody who was not on the air quotes 20% of that list, they got sent the minutes, or they could watch the recording on their own time, and everybody, was a net benefit. But just to illustrate the point of, there's organizational habits too, and like, look at your teams and say, have we been doing the same thing so long that there's no momentum behind it? Everybody's feeling kind of burnt out. Like, what changes can we make to impact the habits we form?
Well, this is where assessment and giving yourself the opportunity to ask yourself, where have I been and what have I achieved and where am I going and is this the right path to get there? And this is where building the habit of assessing yourself in comparison to your overall plan is so important. And we don't do it enough, typically, not only as individuals but also as organizations. And we're not talking about, don't be crazy. You shouldn't be changing your plan every single day, of course. And yet giving yourself and your team the opportunity to say, hey, are we just bound by the way it's always been done? Or would it be appropriate, because we're all feeling a certain way and our organization is giving us specific indicators, for us to try something new? The worst case scenario is that it doesn't work out.
Yeah. And maybe you're listening to this and you're like, all of this, yeah, I mean, I get it. Like, in fact, I know this, and you just needed that reminder to check in, and that's a win in and of itself. But sometimes it's simple as you just got
100%.
to mix it up, right? You got to mix it up. You got to change it
You
up.
can change it up.
But it doesn't mean you need to change your goals in the midterm, or even the kind of like mid to short term. You're not shifting that. You're just changing things up a little bit, and giving some variety and some balancing of focus in the equation that keeps things interesting and exciting.
Well, and I think this is where, going back to our earlier conversation, it's so important to build that within your organization, that we say, these are the things that are non-negotiable. We absolutely have to do, we absolutely have to hit, but here's a safe space for you to innovate or try something new or do something the way we've never done it before. And to me, if you have people who are burned out on something like a meeting, which we hear all the time, that we've gone into an environment, especially in virtual environments, where we're just meeting people to death, right? And so often we don't need to have all these people in the meetings, or we don't need to have as many meetings. The worst case scenario of changing up the style of how you approach it, and we've had umpteen incredible people on this podcast that specialize in how to organize these conversations, organize these meetings for maximum capability and maximum outcome. You could try a couple of those and see what works best, and get a stress test at the end of the meeting for where you achieved maximum output and what the feedback was. And ultimately, worst case scenario, if it doesn't go well or you didn't get to where you want to go, you've simply lost one meeting, which probably you had people who were maybe not all the way engaged in to begin with.
Yeah. I mean, it could be, if you're thinking about this in the context of a team, then it could be something as simple as just changing the owner of a meeting, or to give them a stretch opportunity, right? Like, let them run with it for a little bit and manage the communication so people don't feel like they've lost an opportunity. Handle all of that, but like, mix it up for the sake of keeping things interesting, and or gamify something or change the language, and you're just making small turns on the dial just to keep people engaged. That can be really beneficial as well.
Well, and I think it's a reminder of what you have said a couple of times, which is we're not changing the goal. We're potentially just spicing up our path to get there, or perhaps pivoting a bit on our way to there. And we're still going to hold the results for our mile markers along the way to the goal accountable, right? We're still going to make sure that on the way, on the path to this bigger goal that we have, that even if we change the path or even if we change our approach to it, we're still hitting these really important mile markers along the way.
Yeah, and I think to help people relate to this in like the personal context, whether you're applying it professionally or personally, sometimes mixing it up and changing the language is actually in service of continuous improvement if you go small enough. And I'll explain. So an example could be, let's say that what you're doing, you're in sales and you're just making sales calls every week, and you follow our process, you set a goal for the year, you've got a milestone for the month. You've got your one thing for the week is to dial, to call 15 potential leads and have these conversations, but you have that set up so it's the same 15 calls every week. That the opportunity there is each week to keep it interesting and exciting, but also to not feel like you're falling into this monotonous trap of it's the same thing every week, making the 15 calls. I don't change my weekly goal at all. Is go smaller in there and see like, well, what's the one thing you could do differently next week based on what you learned? Okay, I made those 15 calls, but didn't have the success that I was looking for. Why? What's one thing you can do different? Apply that reflection, and now your goal for the week is a slightly different strategy that's interesting. You're trying something new. It's continuous improvement. And so like if you go small enough and change the language based on what you learn, you can avoid some of this monotony of just repeating the same 15 calls, because I see that a lot too.
Well, and this is where accountability and having a structure for accountability along the way is so important. Because if you're going to change it, we often see people fall into the trap of, oh, I needed to freshen it up, or I needed to liven it up, so I changed the path. And then they forget to hold themselves accountable for the results along the way. And if they're not making incremental gains to where they want to go, they sort of blame it on the, oh, well, I made a change, so it hasn't been long enough, or I made this change, so we'll see how this brings us to where we want to go. And this isn't actually effective change. This is shiny object syndrome. We're talking about changing up along the path, but still holding yourself accountable to the increments along the way.
Accountability is a huge part of the process, and try to visualize if you're listening, but if you can see me, like imagine like an exponential curve, right? You've got a really flat, barely making any progress curve, and then you catch the hockey stick, right? Like this. But there's a period like that's, 2/3 of the way down the really flat section that's high risk, right? For you, because that's where you're going to be challenged. You're going to feel like it's monotonous. You haven't quite seen the success. And that's when it's really helpful to have some accountability to keep you doing the right things over time, to get to navigate that really risky section before you actually catch the growth that you're looking for. And there's different ways to do that. Of course, some people are just really good at holding themselves accountable. I'd say it's the exception, not the rule. And even those people would benefit from some accountability. Arguably, they would do even better. But most people, that you need some different forms, and there's ways to do that, to support yourself. There's ways to bring others into your world. You get a lot of this inherently inside of businesses, but oftentimes we find that it's on the surface. It's not, that accountability doesn't quite go deep enough into your kind of week over week and day over day. Of course, that there's exceptions to that too, but that accountability is so crucial.
I also feel like it would be important for us, Chris, to talk about how this typically shows up for people, maybe in a way that they wouldn't recognize. And I'll give context. I find often when someone tells me they're burned out, and I always give bunny ears. If you're not watching us, I give bunny ears around that, because to me, I'm a very visual learner. So whenever I think of burnout, I think of a candle burning out. And the way a candle burns out is that it burns out all the way to the end, and then the candle dies. You can never use it again. And so when somebody tells me they're burned out, I'm like, are you dead? Should we have a more serious intervention? And it usually is their way of saying, I've just been approaching something the same way for too long and not seeing where it's taking me. And so what I mean by that is, in business, I find that burnout happens when we're solving the same stupid problems over and over and over and over again. And so we need to rethink our approach to that problem. Or burnout happens when we've been approaching something the same way and we aren't recognizing the results, or we're not taking the time to actually look at what our gain has been. And so I'd love for us to talk about some other ways, other than someone actually being able to articulate, I'm bored and I'm in the middle of the monotony of success. And it's so rare that somebody actually comes to us with that. I'd love for us to articulate some of the other ways that this might come up. So if our listeners are listening to this and they're like, I don't know if that's me or not, maybe I am feeling that way, but I'm not bored. I'm just feeling burned out. And I'd love for us to call out some other ways that this shows up for people other than just I'm feeling bored, because I think burnout is definitely one.
Mm. Well, something else to go back on something we said earlier, you don't necessarily want to just willy-nilly change your goals. There is a case where I see people on teams especially get burnout, or people focus on personal goals where the goal just doesn't feel achievable, or the plan doesn't feel achievable within the team. Maybe environment has changed, circumstances are changed, or the plan was maybe a little too big for the time interval that you originally dictated. So it might be the right goal for 2 years, but this year it's not realistic, or the team doesn't see that. And so I think that's something to watch out for is look to see if, okay, we've been grinding on this plan for a while and we haven't changed it. Everybody, no one's bought in anymore that this is going to work. And you see people get burnt out there. I'm not sure if you can relate.
For sure. I think we see this especially, to your point, in business, or when we make potentially unrealistic goals and in our personal life. And I think this is where doing the regular accountability and regular assessment is so important, because I'll give a great example. If I've never gone on a weight loss journey before, or I'll use an example we both use often and can both relate to. Maybe I've never run a race before. I'm going from couch to running a long race. Well, going from couch to running an ultra marathon in 1 year is virtually impossible. I'll say it. Someone's going to probably message us and be like, I did it, which is amazing. But for most, for an average, it's virtually impossible. Going from couch to 5K, totally doable within a year's time. Maybe even couch to 10K or marathon. But going from couch to ultra marathon in 1 year is virtually impossible. But as someone who has never run before, you might not know that until you start actually trying to hit that goal, if that makes sense. So you may start moving towards getting to this ultra marathon, let's call it 50 miles, and you do your first 5K, and you made that by the first quarter, we'll call it. And you might look up and say, there's no way I'm going to be able to 10x this before the end of the year. And you quite simply wouldn't have known that as someone who has never done that before. So it's very appropriate that if you're going toward a goal, you're moving towards something that you're trying to achieve, and you've never done it before, it's very appropriate to look up and say, short of a miracle, I'm not going to be able to hit this, at least not in this current plan or this current environment, and therefore I need to adjust. And that's very appropriate.
Yeah, absolutely. You don't know what you don't know. So you tend to maybe overshoot, and then it's completely appropriate if you're going into, especially an unknown domain, to update your goal based on what you learn. It might even change not just the size, but the context of the goal. You might be like, you know what, actually, now that I've learned more, it looks more like this than that. And that's appropriate as well. And we see it all the time. Everyone has a tendency to overestimate what they can do in a year and underestimate dramatically what you can do in 5 or 10, which is why we emphasize so much the importance of goal setting to the now, which is starting someday. That could be 10 years. Let's just call it 10 years, and then working your way backwards from there so that your 1 year goal is lined up like dominoes. And this way you set a more realistic, maybe that's not the right word, but a more attainable, achievable goal in the year time frame than you would have otherwise. But you can see the connectivity and you're bought into it.
I think another way that this often comes up where we identify with people that they're just really in the middle of the monotony of success, Chris, is when somebody looks up and says, maybe I don't want this anymore, or maybe this isn't the goal anymore, or I think I'm going to quit doing this. And there are times when you do the right type of assessment, a true assessment, especially if you're doing it alongside of a coach, where that very well may be true. You may make decisions along the way, and you have every right to, because it's your life, right? You may make decisions along the way that this just quite simply isn't right for you anymore. But often we see that if someone doesn't recognize their incremental gains, we will see them give up a little bit too soon. Or say, maybe this isn't actually as important to me as I thought it was, or maybe I don't actually care about this anymore, which is really just psychological protection for I don't want to be disappointed that I'm not going to hit this goal. So there is a balance between maybe it's not possible, or I'm saying it's not possible simply because I'm not willing to do what it would take in order to get there. And that's what we actually have to address. that often will realize that that a company or a person just quite simply isn't doing or willing to do what it would actually take to achieve this. And that's your decision to make as the owner of your life or the owner of your business is, am I willing to do what I would need to do in order to achieve this? And I always give a funny example here. And I could go and become an astronaut. I'm not sure, well, rather, I should say, I'm very sure I'm not willing to do what it would take in order for me to become an astronaut. And so therefore, I'm going to say, I don't want to achieve that. It's not important enough to me. So is it that the goal is not important? In this case, it's not, or that I'm just simply unwilling to do what it would take in order to get there?
Yeah, I'm just going to restate it in a way I heard it recently, similar to what you're saying with Jay Papazan on a webinar we did last week. He said something. It's just a great reminder. It's so simple and it's obvious when you say it. But if you're going to say yes to something, it means you're going to have to say no to something else.
Yep.
And like being honest with yourself up front about what that sacrifice is going to be. And you can even narrow it down. Like, what is the one thing I know I'm going to have to say no to if I'm going to achieve this goal? And that works in the big and the small. And it works in the big vision. It also works in the small actions you're going to take this week. Like, what's the one thing I have to do this week in alignment with my goal for the month and the year and my vision for the future? Well, what's the one thing I know I'm going to have to say no to in order to make that possible? And it's just a really healthy reflection so that you can make that agreement with yourself and honor that agreement.
Without a doubt. Well, Chris, I'm going to put you on the spot because it's just us today. And I'm going to ask you what we always ask everybody before we end this podcast, which is what's the one thing that you would want someone who's listening to this taking away from this conversation today?
It's not if you'll get caught in the monotony of success, it's when. And remind yourself in those moments that extraordinary success is sequential over time. It's not simultaneous, and you're far better off being consistent over time than you are looking for intense swings in behavior in the short term. And if you are struggling to get yourself out of this monotony of success, like look backwards, celebrate the gains that you've made, find ways to mix it up if you need to in the small moments and continuously improve week over week, and find forms of accountability to keep you on track when you're in that risky spot of that last third of the flat part of the hockey stick before you catch the success so you can stay on track.
For sure. All right, everybody. Well, thanks for spending some time with us today, and we'll see you soon.
Bye, everybody.